Funding for Current Conversations is provided by the University of Oklahoma President's Office, the OU Office of Student Affairs, OU Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we have a show from our archives with a legend of documentary filmmaking. Dayton Duncan is the writer who has worked with Ken Burns on many award-winning films about the National Park Service, the Lewis and Clark expedition, baseball, and the Civil War. I hope you enjoy the moving conversation with this important documentary filmmaker. I want to start out talking to you about you as a writer. You're a famous producer guy, and people who pay attention see that you're a very active writer on all these shows. But I think you actually started out as a writer. That's really the thread through your whole career, isn't it?
Yeah, I consider myself first and foremost a journalist, a writer journalist. I've started in a small newspaper in New Hampshire, covering school boards and bond hearings, and graduated to covering politics. I used to write a smart aleck column that appeared once a week in 17 papers in northern New England.
So you got your chops as a writer with that daily discipline of having to train out
copy. And it was a terrific training as a writer. I had not had an ambition of being a writer when I was a kid and even in college. But I learned when I got this job on a newspaper what I loved doing, which is going out and finding out information and coming back and struggling to try to put it into some sort of sense that, got the information across clearly, hopefully with some spice and compellingness.
I think it's really interesting the way you came to being a writer, and it seems like that transition into writing for a really large audience, which you do now with the shows, that was never really a problem. That's the way you thought about writing all the time. And sometimes that is a stumbling block for writers to make that move out to a larger audience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not writing in some sort of personal, revelatory, artistic sense. I hope that some of the things that I write have a little poetry mixed in with the prose, and that it gets to deeper things than just the surface of facts.
I love your scripts.
But that's where I come from, is trying to get information that I think is important or entertaining or interesting, hopefully maybe all three sometimes, across to an everyday audience. And, film is a different way of doing that.
In fact, some of the things you ended up working on as a filmmaker started out as writing projects. I mean, you were interested in Lewis and Clark long before Lewis and Clark, the PBS show, right?
Absolutely. Lewis and Clark is, now part of my bloodstream for almost a quarter century. I went out and retraced the Lewis and Clark Trail for a magazine piece for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine in 1983. And then I got asked by a publisher to turn it into a book. And I said, well, if I'm going to make a book out of it, I'm sorry, I have to go back out and do this whole journey one more time to get more information, which I did. And then that became my first book, Out West.
Haven't you done that 4 times, though?
I've retraced the route 4 different times from St. Louis to the coast and back. And since my first journey out and back in 1983, not a year has passed since then that at least some part of each year I haven't gone to some part of the trail. So I suffer from Lewis and Clark-itis, which is an infectious disease, and I'm in the final terminal stage of it.
I'm so fascinated with your doing the Lewis and Clark expedition route 4 times. Were you traveling the way they traveled? I mean, were you in canoes and boats or whatever?
I was trying to replicate their journey in the spirit that they undertook it. Thomas Jefferson sent them out to say, travel the course of the Missouri River over what he hoped would be a Northwest Passage and finally reach the end of the continent, and come back and tell me and the nation what it is that you found.
And this is after the Louisiana Purchase, so there's all that excitement about that new territory.
Actually, he had planned it before he even completed the Louisiana Purchase. So by the time they left, they were now traveling through newly acquired, quote, American land, at least till they got to the Rocky Mountains. But I was just trying to replicate the spirit of that. So I didn't feel I had to replicate, I didn't have to get a keel boat and pull it against the current of the Missouri River. They, first of all, took them 2.5 years, and for my magazine story, I had a month and a half. So I had to cover more ground more quickly. But in certain places, I would get out on the river in a canoe, or I went out on big tugboats. I went out on, boats at the mouth of the Columbia River that, crab boats and things like that. I went by horseback in certain parts. I hiked portions of it, but I wasn't trying to say this. I wasn't trying to replicate that part of the experience. My job was then to look at what I found on that same journey, the people that I met, the experiences that I had, and to the extent that they were very different than Lewis and Clark's almost 200 years earlier. Then I had a third job, not only recounting my experiences and not only recounting theirs, but somehow to come to grips with the history, American history of the West, between their journey and mine. So it was part history and part journalism.
I think your viewers really pick up that there's something central in your work and your work with Ken Burns about the Lewis and Clark film. And I think, I think I'm probably right about this, I think you've made it, with your success with that film, central in a way for the rest of us it didn't used to be. Lewis and Clark has kind of moved to the center. This came out in 1997. Do you see it as a kind of anchor work in what you all have done?
I can't speak for Ken, who had done a number of films before he and I started more officially working together. But it was an important film for me because it's an important story to me because of the way that I see it, not only in my own life, as sort of the start for me as a writer who writes books versus just a journalist, but I see it as this really important and symbolic moment for us as a nation. In other words, they were sent by this nation which previously had been bounded by the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean, potentially the Brazil of North America, which instead became a continental nation. And they are the first representatives of our nation to go and see all of that and come back and report on it before the nation itself moved along that same track and changed everything in its path. So they're at this hinge moment of history where they're seeing the West before the United States followed them and changed it. And it's just at that moment that I find fascinating.
Well, and you dramatize it so well. There's a moment in the film where you say that this isn't like going to the moon or going into outer space. We do that, we kind of know where we're going. Right. They were stepping off into space because they had really no idea of where they were going. So the drama of that's pretty intense.
Yeah, and we tried to make sure that in our style of storytelling, we don't try to gin up false drama or suspense or anything, but we do try to make sure that you are with them and understand that every school kid in America knows, if they know anything about Lewis and Clark, the one thing they know is that they succeeded, that they got out there and back, which is something that Lewis and Clark didn't know when they left St. Louis.
They didn't find a Northwest Passage, but it wasn't there.
And they didn't know that they were going to succeed. And when their first member dies of a burst appendix, only several months out, they didn't know, as historians know and will write the story when they write it when they write history, as saying that was the only casualty. Well, the people burying Sergeant Charles Floyd in August of 1804 didn't walk away from that burial ceremony saying, boy, I'm glad that this
is the only casualty.
Thank God the only casualty is now behind us. They were thinking, how many of these are we going to have? And is one of them going to be my funeral?
But it's
and so we wanted to keep in our style of storytelling is historical, but it also attempts to try to put you in that place, to suspend your knowledge that's all going to turn out okay.
One of the things you succeed at so well, and it's been absolutely haunting for me, is a sense of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark as sort of characters in history.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about them a little bit? I mean, I have thought about them constantly since I saw that. It's never gone out of my mind since I saw your film. There's such a strong sense of what they were like as a team. You call them the best team ever, and what they were like as individuals.
Well, this is going to sound a little weird, but Meriwether Lewis and William Clark are good friends of mine. I mean, I don't mean it to sound, too whatever, but I've gotten to know them through reading their journals. One of the great glories of American history and literature are the journals of Lewis and Clark and a couple of the sergeants and one private, which left to us this incredible description of them seeing these places and this parts of America that no American citizens.
Now, it's a 40-person team and Lewis and Clark, right?
Yeah, roughly. I mean, it changed sizes from different. And these were the two captains who, breaking all military protocol, Meriwether Lewis as the captain of the expedition, sent by, personally chosen by President Jefferson, decided that he needed to have a co-captain and chose William Clark, who was a little bit older, had once been his commanding officer, but offered him the job of going and helping him lead it and promising him that he would share equally in the decision-making and everything else. That's against all military protocol, and yet I think when you start to get to know these people, Lewis understood, I think, that there are parts of him that were not entirely up to the task.
He's a pretty young guy, what, 30 years old?
He was, about to be 30
Yeah.
when they started off in his 20s, and Clark was in his early 30s. But they made this team that each of them complemented the other person, and they established over the 2.5 years together not only a team, but a friendship, a bond that is just wonderful thing to behold in its own right. And each of them say, Clark is the guy who made sure that everything got done. He's the one you could really rely on. The steady rudder, on the boat. Lewis was a little more mercurial, a little more ethereal. And sometimes I believe it's, people can get into disputes over trying to psychoanalyze a guy who's been dead for 200 years. And I try not to do that, but seemingly capable of withdrawing into himself, which, signs of, what we would now think of as depression.
Bipolar,
and not keeping a journal, though he had been, that was one of the prime orders of President Jefferson. And then suddenly start writing again. And, if you're sort of attuned to those kind of things, and if you've known people like that, you can sort of read that into him. You don't want to probably overdo it, but without Clark, he wouldn't have made it.
And Lewis doesn't do well after the expedition, does he?
No, he fell I would say pretty much fell apart.
Yeah.
He didn't get the journals turned into the book that he had promised the nation. Part of it was because he was made, part of his reward was to be made governor of the new Louisiana Territory. And he's just not cut out for that kind of office job and all those responsibilities. He got into money problems. He drank too much. He may have gotten malaria and be taking drugs for that exacerbated whatever his other conditions would have been, and ended up committing suicide about 3 years after the expedition.
Whereas Clark has a wonderful career after the expedition, right?
Clark was made by the expedition. I mean, he came from a very prominent family of explorers, American explorers, and military men.
It seems like there's a kind of implicit mythology that makes a lot of sense to me in the way you present them in the expedition, that these are sort of prophets in the wilderness getting an advanced look at the grandeur, the expanse of the country, and one prophet doesn't deal so well with that, the other goes to work afterwards. It sort of makes sense to me that way, that Lewis goes crazy and has a bad time because it was just too much for him.
Yeah, I don't know if I go quite that far about that he goes crazy, but they both brought to it different personalities. And part of what they were doing is they were experiencing a landscape that is part of this great nation. The part of who we are as a people is this incredible continent that we inhabit. It has so many different parts. And they came across parts of that in their wildest imaginations they could not have anticipated bison herds of 10,000. They saw species of animals that no one had ever heard of, as they would say, back in the States.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, which just meant east of the Mississippi River, ranging from prairie dogs to grizzly bears. They could have had no conception of the expanse of the Great Plains. The mountains that they came to were much bigger and much more, tangled than they could ever have imagined. And secondly, the web of native peoples who they encountered and upon whom they relied many times for directions, food, shelter, had their own cultures and their own things in ways that they weren't quite ready to understand. They thought they could just come in and say, you've got a new great father, he lives where the sun rises, you are to trade only with us. And they'd heard this story from French traders and Spanish traders and British traders in certain portions. Certain portions had never seen white men before. And they had trouble, I think, contending with the complexities of the native world, that it wasn't monolithic. Each tribe had its own needs and its own desires and its own jealousies with other tribes. And it was naive. They were starting to finally understand how naive it probably was to think that they could just sort of impose an American, peace on the Great Plains that would advantage the United States and serve their trade relations.
I think you're suggesting, and this was my sense watching that film, is that the American experience is there in a kind of embryonic form, in a nutshell, and the encounter with native peoples and the democracy that comes up and the way they decide what to do on the expedition, et cetera, really looks ahead to the national experience.
Yeah, it's both a seed of a future, and it also suggests things that of alternative ways that history could have gone. They, with very few exceptions, got along wonderfully well with the native tribes that they met. Now, part of that is that they're in the position of a little bit outnumbered. Mm-hmm. They're not a big position to sort of bully people
Boss
around.
People around, yeah.
But nonetheless, they finally established over time relationships with most of the tribes that they met that we did not replicate.
Yeah.
And so if it has within it the sense of a missed moment of American history. What if we had done it more like that?
Right.
Wouldn't our history be have a little less tragedy and sadness within it? And you sort of wish that it could have been that way. And then at the same time, implicit in what they're doing is this, you can feel this almost inevitable thing coming that's going to be coming behind it. And there's a sadness, a bittersweet sadness in that. And yet also it's this wide-eyed look at the continent and the bounty that became the thing that, that attracted people westward for the rest of that century.
It sounds like you're starting to talk about what I think of as just the really great work that you've done. 2009, the national parks. Wow, what an epic drama.
Yeah.
You deal with 53 of the 58 national parks, right?
Well, we filmed in 53 of the 58 national parks. We have images of all 58. We don't tell the story of every single park. The concept for national parks was to look at, make us as or not make us, but encourage us as Americans to look at our national parks a little differently than we do. We take it for granted that they exist, that they're protected for us to go see. And that's the farthest from the historical truth. All of human history, up until we decided as a nation to start preserving our most majestic places as parks in perpetuity for everyone, up until that time, all of those kind of places were the exclusive preserve of the king and royalty, the richest people, the most privileged and insiders. So when we decided that we were going to do it differently, that was a radical decision.
Original idea, really.
And original to us as and as we say in the film, as uniquely American as the Declaration of Independence and just as radical. So we wanted to look at those, how did that happen? Who are the people behind it? And what you find is the story of every single national park, when you turn that rock over, is not the self-evident thought that it was going to become protected and preserved for future Americans, but a struggle that was started by one person, two people, three people, group of people, several groups of people who said, we love this place. We are transformed in our experiences by seeing it and experiencing it. And we want people forever to have that same chance that we did. Generations that we'll never know.
Yeah.
We want them the chance to fall in love with it too. And and there were long, struggles to finally get the government, in park after park after park, to set it aside.
It seemed to me there were two major notes that really stuck out to me. One, I think you're already talking about, the national parks as an icon of national identity,
Right.
national experience. The other one, and you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, is a sense of sort of religiosity. There are moments where a ranger, Shelton Johnson, is talking about delivering mail and coming into a snow-covered area, and he sees a bison buffalo, and what could be just a beautiful scene really turned into something like a religious epiphany.
Right.
And that comes up again and again, that there's a kind of spirit and a kind of religiosity, a deep sense of who we are as Americans that may be only available through the national park experience.
Yeah, that's true historically and now. It's always been true of our experience in these very special places. I don't think it's only available there. I think it is just the door opens so much, broader.
It's so powerful there.
And it's so powerful there that it connects you to things that are larger than yourself, that have been there forever, or that are timeless. And you feel, as John Muir said, that when you try to pick out anything by itself, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. In other words, you feel this transcendent connection to the natural world that in our everyday lives, particularly the more you get closer to modern times, that we are increasingly separated from. But it's just unavoidable there. And so when Shelton Johnson talks about stopping his snowmobile as he's delivering mail in winter in Yellowstone and sees this bison herd, and he said, I started looking at that and thinking, this is the first dawn, and these shadows that I'm seeing are the first shadows that have ever been cast, and they're breathing and I'm breathing, and we're all in unison. He was, saying exactly the same thing that John Muir had felt 100 years earlier when he wrote, as we open our film, one learns that the world, though made, is yet being made, that this is still the morning of creation. In other words, we are witness to something eternal.
That's a religious vision,
and
getting back to an origin.
That is religious, but it doesn't have to be necessarily organized religiously.
No.
It's spiritual and religious, and things that Emerson wrote about, as the Transcendentalists wrote about and felt, that in nature is where, rather than cathedrals that we built, in the cathedral of nature is where if we let ourselves be transparent to it, the transparent eyeball, as Emerson
spirituality
would say.
that's...
If you open yourself to it, you will transcend your moment and your own bounds of your time and your life, and you are part of something that is eternal. And I think that that's very much the case in national parks. And additionally to it, it is also in the sense that this is something that we pass on to our next generation.
Yeah.
If I'm standing as I have, at Jenny Lake in the Grand Tetons with my children, I am both the 9-year-old boy who stood there with his mother, who considered it the most beautiful sight she ever saw, and I'm also the father of my 2 children, holding their hand, and knowing, hoping that someday they'll be doing it. So time is compressing and expanding at the same point on a personal level, which is, you can call it religious, you can call it whatever, but you can feel that if you're lucky enough to have had an intergenerational, because so much else in our world changes all the time.
I know
and a park is a place where you can go back and you can stand there and know that what you're seeing, this is what John Muir saw, or this is what the Hopi Indians were experiencing, and this is what generations upon have seen, and extend yourself to say, and long after I'm gone, if we do it right, other people can stand here and feel this same sense of transcendence and openness and a connection to that makes us both much smaller because you're facing the
Immensity.
infinity and the immensity of the natural world, and yet larger because you are expanding to fill that space within your spirit. And that's what parks do. They rearrange your molecules a little bit.
Well, that is a beautiful vision, and you convey it so powerfully, as you do here. You convey it powerfully here, but very, very powerfully in the film. So,
I got a lot of good footage. It's better to see it. And as much as we think that our film helps to capture that spirit and to capture the sense of the place, what we also had hoped to do, and it turned out to happen. And we are both Ken and I, one of the greatest thrills of our lives was both the fact that what we were hoping that lots of people would watch it, and that what they would say is, I got to get in my car, or I got to go to those places and take, if I'm a parent, take my kids so they can experience that too. And that happened, and the National Park Service bestowed on both of us the great honor, I think, of being honorary park rangers. I'm sorry I didn't bring my hat with me today.
Dayton Duncan, we are out of time. I wish we had a couple more hours. Thank you for this. It's really been a very special show. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this special show from our archives. Join us next time for more current conversation. Thank you for watching.